we can't really do too much about our genetic constitution, but we can do a significant amount about environmental risk factors. The neurons in the brain seem to be starved of glucose, and as a result of this, they seem to die. But all of these diseases, in some way or another, are linked to disruptions in systemic energy metabolism. They damage the respiration in the mitochondria of the cells, forcing the cell into a fermentation metabolism, which then produces reactive oxygen species, which then produce the mutations that people find in these tumor cells.
Ryan Muncie is probably the smartest guy I know.
Trust me, Muncie is the nutrition guy.
Ryan Muncie's out there trying to make the world better for all of us.
The Optimal Performance Podcast is bold, edgy, creative, entertaining, and epic.
Ryan Muncie is my go-to guy.
Ryan Muncie he's the first guy I call.
He's making people's lives better. Ryan Muncie's an innovator.
You are listening to the Optimal Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Muncie. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending time with us today. And I've got a really cool show for you. We've been on a roll lately here on the OPP. We've been fortunate to have some amazing guests. I am incredibly grateful for you guys being here listening and for these guests spending their time and sharing their expertise with us so that we can bring you such amazing shows. Looking back at a couple of the past episodes, we just published one with Dr. Cyrus Raji on Alzheimer's and brain imaging. Amazing episode. If you didn't catch that, go back and listen to it. Of course, we had Catherine Arnston on talking about spirulina and chlorella, the benefits of algae as a superfood. About 2 weeks ago, we had Eric Rimmensberger on the show. Eric survived cancer. He was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer, healed his own cancer without modern, normal standard of care medicine, no radiation, no chemotherapy. Part of the research that he looked into that led him down that path was by a man named Thomas Seyfried. Our guest on the show today is none other than Thomas Seyfried. Thomas is a leading cancer researcher and a biology professor at Boston College. His research has been included in some of the big books circulating now in the cancer sort of revolution, if you want to call it. Tripping Over the Truth is a book that cites Seyfried's research quite a bit. Dr. Seyfried has partnered with one of our friends here on the OPP and somebody that you probably know very well, Dominic D'Agostino. But Dr. Seyfried's research focuses on mechanisms by which metabolic therapies can manage chronic disease such as epilepsy, neurodegenerative lipid storage diseases, and cancer. The metabolic therapies include caloric restriction, fasting, ketogenic diets. We're going to talk about all of these on the show today. In the case of cancer, these therapies target and kill tumor cells while enhancing the physiological health of normal cells. The neurochemical and genetic mechanisms of these phenomena are under investigation in novel animal models and include the processes of inflammation, cellular physiology, angiogenesis, and lipid biochemistry. That's a pretty cool bio, if I can say so myself. So Dr. Seyfried is, he's very passionate, very knowledgeable. This is a really cool podcast. I know you're going to love it. Before we get to Dr. Seyfried, a couple of housekeeping notes. As always, you guys know this by now. Please go to iTunes, leave us a 5-star review. Let us know how much you love this show. When we read your review on the air, we will hook you up with free Natural Stacks products. All you have to do is email me when you hear your review read. Gotti646, email me, ryan@naturalstacks.com. I'm about to read your review. 5 stars, top 5 podcast. Awesome topics and guests. Ryan does a great job asking questions and getting the most out of his guests. For helpful information listeners can apply to improve their lives. A must listen and subscribe if you want to improve your health, fitness, or overall quality of life. Gotti646. Thank you for your support. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the review. Email me, Ryan@naturalstacks.com. We'll hook you up with a little care package. For everybody else listening, there will be some things in this show today that you want to share with people you know. Please do just that. Grab the little link in your podcast listening device, whether it's Stitcher or iTunes, wherever you listen, there's a shareable link. Grab that link, text it, email it, share it on social media. Get the word out to people you know who will benefit from and need to hear the things that we're talking about on the show today and the OPP in general. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you sharing this information. That's how we ultimately help more people, and that's what this is about. Last piece of information, make sure you go to naturalstacks.com. You'll be able to see the blog post for this, along with the video version and all of the links to the studies and resources that Dr. Seyfried is going to mention. All right, I'm done. Enjoy the show. Dr. Seyfried, thanks for hanging out with us today.
No, thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. I think, as I just told you before we hit record, I want to start with a few kind of broad questions on some of your expertise in gene and environmental interactions, which our audience may recognize as epigenetics. If I had to, kind of put your hand to the fire and say, what's the single biggest lifestyle choice that we can control in that area, what would you say?
Well, it's probably food is one. Maybe the most important one, but it's certainly certain lifestyle issues, exercise and things like this, I think are probably of the major importance, at least the ones that we can control. And those are fairly broad areas, very difficult to control these in the environment in which we live, in a westernized society where we are challenged every day by the kinds of foods and exposures we have. But if we're aware of these things, at least we have some level of control. Right.
Now, in the realm of things that we may have less control over, sort of environmental type things, what has you most concerned?
Well, I mean, we can control, if we are aware of our hazards in the environment, you do your best to try to avoid them. But I think what we have the least control over is our genetics. I mean, we can't do anything about that. We inherit genes from our parents, and if you know that you are at risk for a particular disease, and you know that there are environmental factors that can reduce your risk, despite the fact that you may have a genetic predisposition, at least you have some level of control. Not to say it's a perfect control, but at least it's some level of control.
So would it be safe to assume then that you are a fan of things like 23andMe or some sort of genetic code research where we can look into our own genes and use that to sort of plan our choices and lifestyle?
No, not really. I mean, even if we were to know about it, there's not much we can do about our genetics. But if everyone were to assume that they had some genetic risk factor for, say, type 2 diabetes, whether or not they do or not, just challenging yourself to try to avoid those things that would put you at risk. Most of the chronic diseases that afflict people are controllable. Some people, you say, wow, some of these people can smoke all day long. They eat the worst kinds of foods. They don't exercise, and yet they're disease-free for the most part. Those people inherit genes that protect them against all this. There's very few of those kinds of people around. But the ones you find, oh, wow, if that guy can do it, so can I. Wrong. You may not be able to do that. That guy just happens to have all the genes that protect him. The rest of us probably don't have that whole constellation of genes. So, because there's guys that you live, this guy's 95. There was a guy the other day, he's 102 years old, jumping out of an airplane, right? I mean, he has a very powerful genetic constitution. Most people don't live to be 102, much less jumping out of airplanes. He's very fortunate to have a genetic constitution that's protected him against all kinds of environmental risks for his entire life. The rest of us, most of us, don't have that. So I don't think we can't really do too much about our genetic constitution, but we can do a significant amount about environmental risk factors. I think we have control over that. So if one were to assume that, hey, listen, I have a predisposition to Alzheimer's, diabetes, and cancer, any one of those are going to kill me. What am I going to do in my life to try to reduce my risk? And those are personal choices. And unfortunately, most people roll the dice and say, hopefully it's not going to be me.
Right.
So I don't have to make those difficult choices.
Right.
But, these are some of the things. These are more philosophical things than actually, than actual situations.
Well, what about the neurodegeneration front? That's another area where you have some interest. Is there something specifically that you like to focus on to reduce risk for neurodegeneration?
Well, I think the most common neurodegenerative disease is Alzheimer's disease, and that is largely an environmental problem, a gene environmental problem to be exact. There are very few people, maybe less than 5%, that actually inherit a particular mutation that's going to make or give them a high risk to have Alzheimer's disease. Then there are other inherited factors that put you at risk only if you are in a provocative environment, an inflammatory state of health, together with ApoE4 mutation, would increase your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. But a majority of people who get Alzheimer's disease don't appear to have any genetic risk factors. So, and then they're always trying to find others. So this tells us that disease itself is largely due to environmental factors. And what are these environmental factors that would put you at risk for Alzheimer's disease? Actually, it's, again, neuroinflammation. It's very interesting that Alzheimer's disease is kind of a hypometabolic disease. Blood sugars are reduced. The neurons in the brain seem to be starved of glucose. And as a result of this, they seem to die, leading then to the pathology that people recognize. So that's an interesting concept, and there's ways to get around that, to feed neurons through ketosis that could protect the neurons from degeneration. And people might want to consider that in their lifestyle. Most people who develop Alzheimer's, they're not sane one day and uncognitive the next. It's a slow progress over decades of exposures. The ultimate result is, a cognitive decline and dementia. There's many different forms of dementia. They're not all Alzheimer's disease. So there's prefrontal dementias, and there's a variety of these kinds of diseases. These are neurodegenerative diseases that could be delayed through proper diets and lifestyles. I think this is. Now, there are other neurodegenerative diseases like CTE, the football players, so boxers and football players and these kinds of athletes. So if you want to avoid that, don't play those games. It's just this kind of a thing, right?
Right.
You want CTE, you play football, right?
Yeah, we actually just recorded and published a podcast a few weeks ago, and that was with Dr. Cyrus Raji, and we talked about 110 out of 111 brains donated to the brain research from NFL players showed pathological signs of, or pathologically diagnosed CTE. So yeah, you're absolutely right. All right. So something you said there, I want to sort of dig into a little bit more, where you said that in brains with Alzheimer's, they're sort of starved of glucose. I understand, and I think our audience understands the difference in fat and glucose as fuel pathways. So my question immediately was going to be, that sort of starved of glucose makes me it's curious, because I know we're going to talk a lot about ketosis today when we get into cancer and the metabolism of cancer. But what is it about those neural cells that, okay, if they become starved of glucose, say somebody was following a high carbohydrate diet, or they were carb dependent for their fuel sources, what is it about that where they would develop some sort of dysfunction or disordered metabolism of that glucose, yet those same cells would not have disordered metabolism of ketones?
Yeah, well, it has to do with the transporters that allow the fuels to get into the brain. So the brain uses glucose primarily on a daily basis. Our brain sucks in more glucose than any other organ system in the body. 20 or 22% of the entire metabolism of our body is devoted to the function of the brain. The brain can also use another fuel, ketones, because if we stop eating and blood sugar goes down, we don't fall down and become unconscious. We start transitioning to an alternative fuel gradually. As glucose is less and less, the body will burn fats to produce ketones. These ketones come through a different transporter system. They're not dependent on the glucose transporter. They're dependent on a monocarboxylic acid transporter that brings in ketones. And they serve as an alternative fuel for glucose. And they are much more powerful in their ability to generate energy. And also, they generate fewer free radical damage. They give a much higher efficiency of energy. Whereas in, say, Alzheimer's disease, there's problems in glucose transporters, at least there's some reports to say that. Therefore, the prime fuel is being deprived. There's also an interesting connection from the National Cancer Institute questioning the why people with Alzheimer's disease, their risk for cancer is less. And it's kind of an interesting, what they call the provocative question. And it's known that Alzheimer's, you have a starvation of glucose, a hypometabolic state. And whereas cancer is just the opposite. You need a lot of glucose to drive the disease. So if your body is hypometabolic, it's going to be unlikely, not completely. There's people, just in general, it's going to be less likely you'll develop a tumor that requires a high energy of glucose, and you can't develop that. Your brain is dying, but your tumor would not be able to grow also. So you have this, in one case, the neurons are starving of glucose, but you can't develop cancer. Excuse me. On the other hand, tumor cells need glucose and they can't grow too well. So it's a very interesting, all of these diseases in some way or another are linked to disruptions in systemic energy metabolism. So in one case, it might be one molecule. In another case, it might be another molecule. So the brain is flexible. It can burn glucose and ketones, and the liver, of course, goes quite active when blood sugar goes down, because the liver can make glucose from within, and that will provide the brain. Most of that glucose is going to the brain. The rest of it is provided by ketones, and this prevents us from going unconscious. So when blood sugars become reduced, now if you take someone who is not in therapeutic ketosis and give them insulin, it clears the sugar right out of their blood and they become unconscious. This is an insulin surge. Some of these people with diabetes have these kinds of reactions. But if a person is in therapeutic ketosis and then gets the insulin, oftentimes, at least we've done it in the animals, in the mice, they don't go unconscious. because their brain is actually burning an alternative fuel. So even if you take away all the glucose, that brain is still functional because it's burning ketones. So you have a very different physiological response.
Okay. Can you clarify the difference between therapeutic and nutritional ketosis?
Well, I think therapeutic and nutritional ketosis are the same thing,
Okay.
or very similar. This is a very different situation than ketoacidosis,
Right.
which is very, very unphysiologically high levels of ketones, usually associated with type 1 diabetes, where you have both high blood sugar and high ketones together in the blood. This is a very dangerous metabolic situation, very different from therapeutic ketosis, where the body is gaining a health advantage by burning ketones.
Now, your interest in ketosis, your sort of exploration of that, did it predate some of your findings with the metabolism of cancer, or was it vice versa?
No, it did predate, because we had been working with ketogenic diets in epilepsy, which is the area where most of this research has been done. And that goes back to the 1920s, when people were finding that, to stop epileptic seizures, if the people would stop eating for several days, the seizures would disappear. But, this is not a long-term therapeutic situation. So, what happens when people stop eating? Blood sugar goes down and ketones go up. And some of the physicians of the day tried to replicate this physiological state through a dietary intervention, which would allow blood sugars to remain low and steady and ketones to be elevated, using a dietary approach rather than, fasting, which brings us to starvation, and you can't be healthy when you're starving. So these diets were designed to replicate the physiological state of fasting. Mm-hmm. And it's well known that therapeutic fasting, that's the inanition, stopping of eating food for several days to weeks, is generally is a state of great health. Again, you don't do this for extended periods of time, because then you enter into the realm of starvation, which is a very pathological state, as you know. Mm-hmm. But before you hit the starvation threshold, fasting and therapeutic ketosis can be very healthy.
So I'm just curious now, do you practice intermittent fasting? Do you do water fasts? Or if so, like what's your protocol for working those into your routine?
Well, I don't do it as much as people might think. If I were to have cancer, certainly I would do these things. 18-hour fasts, which are really, very minor in state. I do that quite often, but 3-day fasts, I did that once. It's not easy. The older you get, the harder it is. You, young guy like you should be able to handle that no problem. My students can handle it. But you get guys in their 60s and 70s, and you tell them, okay, let's stop eating for 3 to 5 days. And they say, you do it and tell me what it's like.
But wouldn't you argue then that, that's a sign that they need it more? You just talked about that flexibility.
Yeah. Well, the issue, of course, is your brain over years becomes set in certain ways. And glucose addiction is a very powerful addiction. It's every bit as strong as it can be for some people, every bit as strong as a cocaine or alcohol addiction. It's hard for the brain in other words, when you start lowering blood sugar, the body physiological changes go through a withdrawal physiology that's every bit as similar to a nicotine withdrawal or an alcohol or drug withdrawal. Mm. The difference, of course, is that the body evolved over millions. Our bodies have evolved over millions of years to exist in a semi-starved state. So, we're really not. We just have to break that barrier to the glucose addiction, and then we enter back into the physiological condition that we really evolved in, which has always been a semi-starved state, because food was only available when you could catch it, or have it in the environment at a particular season. It wasn't always a constant high level of high carbohydrate, high energy foods, and now we find ourselves in a very different environment, leading to a whole range of chronic illnesses that result from this new, what we call a new food environment.
Yeah, that's very well said. So I guess let's sort of dive into what you have discovered or written about and spoken about with cancer being, in your words, a disease of mitochondrial. It's a mitochondrial metabolic disease, right?
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue that needs to be addressed and understood by people. Not only the lay public. The lay public seems to understand this better than do the professional scientists. That cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease.
Why do you think that is?
It's because of the indoctrination that most of these folks have been subjected to over the years. It's quite recognized that cancer is a genetic disease in all the textbooks, and most of the scientific research done and sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, the National Institutes of Health, is based on the hypothesis that cancer is a genetic disease. So if you have been a person who has received significant money over decades of research looking for gene mutations in cancer and all these other kinds of things, that's kind of an addiction also, and it needs to be broken because that line of research and that emphasis has amounted to very little progress in our management of the disease. And it stems, the little progress that we have made in cancer over the last 50 years has been due in large part to the false or the misunderstanding of what the nature of the disease actually is. Once we understand that this is a mitochondrial metabolic disease, then the kinds of therapies and approaches become totally different. Diseases can be managed non-toxically, very cost-effectively. Non-toxic therapies that we now see are beginning to work, and this will change the entire perspective of what this disease actually is.
Well, and I think now is as good a time as any to remind our listeners of a few things. Number one, I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. Dr. Seyfried is on the show because his name came up in an episode a few weeks back. Go check that one out. We had Eric Rimmensberger on the show, and Eric is a cancer survivor. He was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer. It was a 9 on the Gleason scale. It was inoperable, and he healed himself without radiation or chemotherapy. And among the resources that he used, some of that was Dr. Seyfried's work. Some of it was the book Tripping Over the Truth, which has your name on the back and a lot of your work inside it. You have a book as well, Cancer as a Metabolic Disorder, or Metabolic Disease. I'm sorry. We'll have links to all of this in the show notes for you guys. So one slight, I guess, not pushback, but just a question then. There is a study out that recently came out saying that estimated 40.8% of incident cancer cases attributable to exposure of the 24 risk factors included in this analysis. So basically they're saying that, these risk factors, are the environmental things that can lead to cancer, which would support that it's not a genetic thing. My question is, what about the other 60% of cancers that were not attributable to those risk factors?
Well, we broke down the origin of the disease to show how all of the risk factors, whether environmental or genetic, target the mitochondria. So, and that means the genetic risk factors are secondary, not primary. Okay. If you're exposed to various what we call carcinogens damage the respiration in certain cells populations of cells in tissues and organs, putting them on the path to forming a tumor. So people know we avoid carcinogens because carcinogens are cancer-producing agents. How do they produce cancer? They damage the respiration in the mitochondria of the cells, forcing the cell into a fermentation metabolism, which then produces reactive oxygen species, which then produce the mutations that people find in these tumor cells. So the mutations themselves, what we call somatic mutations, not mutations that you inherit in your genome, but somatic mutations, are produced as downstream products, epiphenomena of the damage to the respiration. So viruses can produce cancer, and people say, how does that happen? Viruses damage the respiration in the cells, the mitochondria, thereby forcing the cells into a fermentation metabolism, thereby producing a whole array of different mutations. Inflammation can damage the same thing. So then you have your inherited mutations, like BRCA1, BRCA2, the Li-Fraumeni. There's a variety of so-called inherited genes that predispose you to cancer. These genes also damage the mitochondria and respiration, producing then a plethora of other kinds of somatic mutations. So we then view the inherited conditions as secondary, not primary. And the reason for that is some people inherit BRCA1 and they never develop cancer. They have the gene, but the gene does not, in those people, damage the respiration. Therefore, they do not get cancer. Same with the Li-Fraumeni. This is called penetrance. It's like what is the probability that I'll manifest the disease based on the fact that I carry the gene? So then if you look at the whole population, you find that the BRCA1 is about 40 to 50% penetrant, which means that 50% of the people who have the gene develop the disease, and 50% of the people who have the gene don't develop the disease. So what's going on with these? But only the people that develop the disease where the gene damages the respiration. The other folks, and for one reason or another, mitochondria were protected, and we're not. So this then puts the whole cancer perspective into the idea that it's a mitochondrial metabolic disease. So once you realize that, then the strategies, it's a very simple disease once you realize that. And the other thing is that all these cancers are the same, whether it's a brain cancer, a breast cancer, a colon cancer, bladder cancer, they all have the same metabolic problem, a very similar metabolic problem. They ferment. So if these are fermenting cells in different cancers, then what does that mean? Well, the fermentation metabolism requires only fuels that can produce energy without oxygen. So what are these fuels, and what are the major fuels that are driving the disease? It's glucose and glutamine. So what happens to the cancer when you take away the fermentable fuels? They die. So the same strategy can be used to treat and manage the variety of cancers. And today we have 1,600 people a day in this country dying from cancer. It's a silent epidemic that no one's talking about that has a very clear metabolic solution that very few people either understand or are willing to address.
I don't think cancer is silent.
No, I said the epidemic is silent.
Okay, right.
Because you don't hear anything about this. You don't hear every night on the news. If we had 1,600 people a day dying from some other condition,
right.
Oh, it'd be all over the news. Are you kidding me?
Right. Or if 1,600 people died, overseas from, in our military, we would hear about that.
On a daily basis, you would definitely hear about it.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying. Totally understand that. Well, I want to highlight a few things from your work and ask you some questions on these to sort of elaborate. So one of the things that you found when you started looking into this, and you sort of touched on it here a second ago, but when we restrict calories, it drives down blood glucose. And that's regardless of whether it's a normal diet or a ketogenic diet. And that forces cancer cells to compete with healthy cells for fuel. My question is, why is that so effective? Why do our healthy cells win that battle?
Well, you're asking the normal cells of the body, which also use glucose, to upregulate transporters to get more glucose in there. So they're now they're now directly competing with the tumor cell. If the glucose is abundant in the bloodstream, then there's no competition. The tumor cell will be able to suck in as much glucose as possible, the tumor cells, and the normal cells will not put any pressure because they don't need very much glucose. They're so energy efficient. When tumor cells are fermenters, so a fermenting cell is a very metabolically inefficient cell. So the raw material to drive that cell must be present in abundance, whereas the normal cells are much more energy efficient.
So you're sort of, when we're not in a caloric deficit, we're sort of putting our healthy cells in this sort of malaise where they're not motivated. They're sort of too comfortable.
Well, we don't want to look at it in that light, but essentially it's very similar. It's a similar physiological situation.
Okay.
When the body is in a energetically stressed situation, the efficiency of every cell in the body must be at its maximum. Tumor cells are clearly not in that group. They're fermenters. They're not using energy efficiently. As a matter of fact, autophagy, which is self-eating, self-digestion, increases during calorie restriction in these energy efficient states. So inefficient organelles within cells are digested for the good of the cell, or inefficient cells are digested for the good of the whole. Mm-hmm. So what we are ending up with then is a body that's supremely qualified to generate energy at maximal efficiency. If we have a surfeit of energy, these monitoring processes are rarely engaged. So cells that are inefficient are more or less not surveilled, not eliminated, and they persist, which then would lead to risk of developing a tumor dependent on fermentation metabolism.
Okay, no, that makes great sense. So, I mean, that could be another sort of benefit that we lump into that list of benefits for fasting or intermittent fasting, is that it sort of promotes self-selection throughout all of the cells of the body. Yes,
it would keep us in a high state of physiological health, a higher state. Let's put it that way.
Right. So then you guys, in your research, you took that a step further, and not only were you limiting resources, but you switched the resources from glucose to ketones. We haven't even really talked about this yet, but that's been a big part of your book and your work.
Yeah, well, I mean, ketones, in order to metabolize, ketones are beautiful fuel. They generate very few oxygen free radicals compared to the metabolism of glucose. It's a very sophisticated bioenergetic process. So our bodies, our cells can all, most of our cells, not everyone, but can switch from metabolizing glucose for energy to metabolizing ketone bodies for energy. And the liver, of course, uses fatty acids for energy because they make ketones. They don't use ketones. But basically, we transition our whole body over to an alternative fuel, and that requires good, healthy, functional mitochondria. So tumor cells have various degrees of abnormality in their mitochondria, in their ability to generate energy through oxygen. Oxidative phosphorylation. So that part of the mitochondria seems to be defective. And that's why these tumor cells must use fermentation, either in the cytoplasm or in the mitochondria. The mitochondria can ferment amino acids, and glutamine is a primary amino acid. So that then defines what the nature of the tumor is. It's a fermenting machine that uses fermentable products. And ketone is not a fermentable product. Therefore, ketone cannot be used effectively by tumor cells. So if you flood the body with ketones and take away fermentable fuels, you're actually helping the normal cells get stronger and putting a great amount of metabolic pressure on the tumor cells.
You actually found that restricted ketogenic diet was anti-angiogenic, right? And that means it chokes off new blood vessels to the tumor cells?
Yes. So, but the issue, of course, is that the metastatic cell, the cell that actually metastasizes, is a fundamentally different kind of a cell than other tumor cells. So Yes, calorie restriction, fasting, and restricted ketogenic diets stop blood vessels, which can support the growth of a tumor. However, the metastatic cell it's evolved to live in hypoxic environments. This is why anti-angiogenic therapies will be largely ineffective. In fact, are in stopping metastatic cancer.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I hear there's a lot of like natural foods or I guess foods that contain natural phytochemicals or things like that have been shown to be anti-angiogenic. But what you're saying is that they may not be as effective as some people think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you want to stop metastatic cancer, these cells, the metastatic cell is derived from our immune system. It's a corrupted macrophage or leukocyte or one of these kinds of cells, and they thrive on glutamine. So you could remove all the glucose and you could remove all the blood vessels, and these metastatic cells will still be surviving. They once you take away their fermentable amino acid glutamine, and glucose, you got to shut the front door and the back door. Mm-hmm. It's only then when you start to kill off the majority of metastatic cells.
So how do you do that? How do you close that?
You have to use, like, we published a paper recently with my physician colleagues and Dom D'Agostino on the press pulse concept, which is a strategy, a cocktail of drugs and diets and procedures that are designed to eliminate glucose and glutamine strategically. And you need drugs. It's, if you want to resolve cancer, it's very hard to do it with diet alone. You're going to, but the diet becomes an extremely important component of the cocktail. So we use the diet as a chronic stress on the tumor cells in the mechanisms that I just mentioned. And then we introduce hyperbaric oxygen, hyperthermia, insulin potentiation, glutamine targeting drugs, all of which will work synergistically together to degrade the tumor while enhancing the health and vitality of the normal cells. A totally different approach to managing cancer than what we have today in the majority of medical schools, which are almost clueless as to the nature of the disease. Right. So our strategy, I think, we're pretty sure will be the future of how we're going to resolve cancer.
So I noticed in that answer you did not mention radiation or chemotherapy. Would it be your objective to try to avoid using those at all costs because of the damage that they would do to healthy cells?
Well, they put the body at risk for inflammation and other you're damaging respiration. You put your normal cells at risk.
Right.
Chemotherapies are toxic drugs. These drugs are designed to stop proliferation of the cells because it's assumed that mutations lead to dysregulated cell growth. So we're going to use toxic chemicals to break DNA and try to stop. All you have to do is take away the fermentable fuels and you get the same result without the toxicity.
Right.
Why hyperbaric oxygen, we think, kills the tumor cells in a similar way does radiation. Hyperbaric oxygen is a much less toxic approach. So why? So I don't want to get into the obscenity as to why we use these toxic drugs and radiation, because it is an obscenity. And
or you could sum it up with the word money, right?
Which is a kind of an obscenity if you're trying to keep people alive and healthy.
Right. So I want to go back to glutamine. I mean, that's an amino acid, pretty prevalent in a lot of the foods we eat. So would one need to go on a pretty low protein diet to try to eliminate that?
No, you can't. Glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in the body, and it cannot be effectively managed, in my mind, at least at this point, by diet alone. Diets, because our muscles contain glutamine.
Right.
Cancer breaks down our muscles. The tumor will get glutamine.
Is that one of the reasons that cancer causes muscle atrophy? It's basically stealing glutamine from muscles as a fermentable fuel.
Yeah, and other amino acids as well.
Right.
But it's an effective way to fuel the tumor. Fermentable systems require an abundance, a much greater abundance of fuel than does a respiratory system.
Mm-hmm.
So respiratory systems are remarkably efficient, and they can use the minimal amounts of metabolizable fuels. The tumor cell is an ineffective system, so it will use glucose and amino acid fermentation to drive its growth. So the idea then is you have to interfere with these procedures, and also the tumor cells will phagocytate, engulf, and digest inside the tumor cell itself. So you need drugs that will interfere with each one of these steps. But these drugs must be delivered, scheduled, time, and dosed so as not to harm the patient. The key thing here is you want to manage the disease without causing any adverse toxicity to the body.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing cancer patients with bald heads is a clear sign that those individuals are being treated by people who have very little knowledge about the nature of the disease. So every time you see a bald-headed person, you know that person is being mistreated by someone who really doesn't understand the nature of cancer.
That's pretty powerful. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions then, maybe from a preventative standpoint. If someone doesn't have cancer and was looking to protect themselves, how do we protect mitochondrial metabolism? What would be some things that you would suggest?
I think the best way to do that is therapeutic fasting. People will always say, can't you find an easier way? It'd have to be so draconian. It's like, oh man, isn't there another way? Well, there is. You eat certain diets that are going to be healthy for the body overall and mitochondria. But the best way to get mitochondria healthy is to burn ketones. So you have to do that strategically. You have to lower the blood sugar and you have to elevate the blood ketones. And, we published this glucose ketone index calculator in open access. And I think the app Heads Up Health is using it for general well-being and health for people. It's a simple device. It just calculates the millimoles of glucose and the ratio of glucose to ketones. And if the lower the number, it's like a golf score. The lower the number, the better you are. So, this is a tool that allows normal, healthy people without disease to know whether or not they're in a metabolic zone that's maximally efficient for keeping their mitochondria healthy.
That's really cool. So a couple of things here then. We'll put a link to that on the show notes for you guys listening. We'll make it easy for you to find that. And that was the Heads Up Health app. And then I'll actually have a link to the index. We'll put a link to all the papers that we've mentioned, as well as any research that you want to share with us, Dr. Seyfried. If you email that to me, I'll put links to that in the blog post for this. So I guess just trying to dig for a specific recommendation then on the fasting. Like, how would we implement that? Would an 18-hour fast once or twice a week be enough? Should we try to do the water fast for 3 days every 2 months? Yeah.
Well, since we started all this, we're finding that the lay public are coming up with some innovative ways to enhance this. It's amazing. So once you define the parameters that you need to be in, then people find ways to get into those zones that may not be as difficult as what we all thought might have been. So I've spoken to some folks who like to go on a somewhat slightly restricted ketogenic diet, lowering their blood sugar and elevating their ketones, and then going on a water-only fast. And they say the transition now becomes so much less difficult when making those kinds of transitions, as opposed to, okay, let's just cut out all food and just drink, water or green tea or something like this. This is hard. I tell you, after the second day, it's not easy. Believe me, you're ready to.
Right, but if you can go 2 days, that's 48 hours. That's pretty substantial and makes a significant impact, right?
Well, it does, but it's to really get the body into the zone of surveillance where we're eliminating ineffective cells. You're talking about 5 to 7 days.
Okay.
10 days. You try not stop eating for 10 days. The problem, of course, is that I haven't done this, but those guys who do it, the first 5 or 6 days is very, very hard. I mean, people think they're going to die. I mean, that's how bad it is.
So to really get into that self-selection phase for all the cells of our body, we've got to get to that 5 to 7 day.
Well, I think you have to stay in the metabolic zone for at least several days. And I think that zone is dictated by your glucose ketone index.
Okay.
And, and people have taken ketone supplements along with therapeutic fasting. So my colleague, Don D'Agostino from University of South Florida, he's been showing people how you can really bring those the GKI down to really low levels. Blood sugars in the 25 to 30 milligram per deciliter. Most physicians would say you should be dead.
Yeah. Right.
But you're not, and that's because we're burning the ketones. So how long can you stay in these metabolic zones? How in this? But you have there are guys on the web. If you go out and look at GKI guys, they've been doing fasting for 10 days using our GKI to maintain their zone of metabolic efficiency. But you don't want people to go overboard with this stuff. You'd be surprised how many of these people become fanatics at this.
Right.
Oh, I can do it longer than you. I can get a lower blood sugar than you, and higher ketones than you. I mean, it's like, what is going on here?
Right.
But
they've lost sight. They've lost sight of why they're doing it.
Yeah, I think that becomes the challenge, right? Notwithstanding, I think for the majority of people in the population that just would like to know that there is something that they themselves can take charge of and do to maybe once a year or whatever, it makes them feel good. It just says it's tough to do, but I did it, and I think I feel a lot better.
Right.
And that's, I think, the ultimate goal of this.
Yeah, I think you also kind of, if that was the outline for people looking for preventative, I think you've also sort of outlined a template for, the treatment protocol if someone were to be diagnosed with cancer. I know you couldn't get into specifics without, knowing the individual, but if someone were, say, diagnosed with cancer, or if somebody listening has a family member or a friend that, gets diagnosed and they want to send them this episode as a resource, where would you direct somebody recently diagnosed with cancer trying to figure out their best course of action? Yeah,
well, this is an important problem, probably the singular most important problem. It's a tragedy. We know what to do. We have some physicians who can do it. The problem is the system, the way it's set up now, prevents us from doing this. In other words, using drugs and diets and procedures in a cocktail therapy not involving radiation and chemo is just not acceptable to treat somebody with cancer like this. So, and that's why some of these really important and evidence medicine is coming from outside the United States. In Turkey, I'll send you the paper, because they're achieving remarkable success in applying this metabolic approach, this press pulse strategy for cancer patients, with remarkable success for a broad range of stage 4 cancers. Now, what we do in this country is, we might consider a metabolic approach only after you've had the standard of care. And for brain cancer, that's devastating. I mean, you're getting irradiated and poisoned, and you're expecting to get healthy after something like this. This is not in the what's going to happen. So you need to take these metabolic therapies, and you need to do them first. And we're seeing when people do that without the toxicity, the responses are remarkably better. Now, this is going to be a very hard pill to swallow for the strategies in this country, that we can manage this disease without these toxic treatments. And of course, the argument is from the establishment is, where are the clinical trials to document this? And the question is, you'd have to change the structure of the standards of care to allow these kinds of studies to be done. And they're based on such fundamentally hard scientific evidence, it becomes difficult to deny that this would work. And so they said, we don't see the clinical trial. First of all, who's going to do the trial?
Right. And that's the biggest, to me, that's the biggest obstacle that people like you face with getting these clinical trials, is that the people who fund the clinical trials will not fund this hypothesis. Because if it works, then they're going to lose a shitload of money.
Oh, We call, what we call this? A disruptive technology.
Right.
Only it could be the singular greatest disruptive technology in the history of medicine.
Right. Well, and you mentioned Press Pulse a few times. We've talked about your book. We've talked about this book, Tripping Over the Truth. And the Press Pulse is in there, page 174. They mention your name. They mention our friend, and you mentioned Dom's name a few times. And then again, your book is Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. Can we do a little giveaway and give 1 or 2 copies of your book away to our listeners?
Well, you have to try to convince John Wiley Press of that.
Okay.
So far, I have not been able to get even 3 books for myself.
All right. I tell you what, I'll buy one.
Try to do that because they're translating the book into Chinese and I think some other languages as well.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah. If I want a copy of my book, I've got to buy a copy.
All right. Here's what we'll do. I'm going to buy.
Cheap. Unfortunately, it's not cheap.
I'm going to buy a copy. And for you guys listening, share this podcast on social media. Tag me so that I know you did it. And I will choose one winner and send you a copy of the book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease.
Yeah, and if they send it back to me, I'll sign it and send it back to them.
All right, there you go. You guys heard it. You can get an autographed copy that way. All right, Dr. Seyfried, this has been great. 2 more questions for you. Number 1, if our listeners want more of you, where can they find more of you and your work?
Well, I think we're doing a lot of podcasts. We're doing a lot of YouTube videos. There'll be a movie out on the cancer series in dogs. Actually, I didn't mention anything about the dog stuff, but the dogs are responding remarkably well to metabolic therapies.
Wow.
And cancer in dogs is just as much of an epidemic as it is in humans. And the dogs are doing remarkably well.
Briefly, are you taking the same mitochondrial approach?
Oh, yeah, same thing. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. All the cancers are the same.
Yeah.
So
Ketosis for dogs?
Yes, exactly. It works really well.
Is Dom manufacturing doggy ketones?
No, not yet. But we're giving them raw meat diets, keto diets, and hyperbaric oxygen. We're doing the same thing, basically.
Wow.
With some drugs. And this is another indication that all these cancers are the same. So when you have people running for breast cancer, colon, brain, it's all the same disease. People have to understand these are not, cancer is not, you hear this on the news, cancer is 1,000 diseases. No, it's not. It's a singular disease of energy metabolism. All these cancers respond to the same therapy. And this is like, what? How can you explain this? Because if you understand the basic biochemical problem in the tumor cell, all this becomes completely explainable. It's not that complicated. People make it out to be such a complicated disease. We're cutting out livers and cutting out colons. You don't need to be doing all that stuff. It's just, you can shrink those tumors down. I mean, half the surgeries we don't need, the chemicals we don't need. I mean, this is just, when you start to look into it, it's going to be unbelievable. Yeah. So dogs, yes, the dogs. So there's a big movie coming out. It's called Dog Cancer Series. I think Joe Mercola has a movie or series of movies on diet and disease. So there's a number of different mediums that are starting to show this work, and the lay people are getting more and more educated about this. They need to know about this. So I think the change will come probably from a grassroots, very unlikely to come from the top medical schools. They have too much to lose as the result of this.
Right. Right. So for you guys listening, go to naturalstacks.com. I will put links to all of these things, the book, bios, everything that you guys would want to follow up on. I'll put a link for you guys to do that as well. Final question, Dr. Seyfried, your top 3 tips to live optimal.
Oh, geez. Do things you like to do. That's stay stress-free, and try to fast whenever you can.
All right. We can do all of those. All right. This has been great. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. For you guys listening, remember, share this episode on social media, tag me and Natural Stacks so that we know you did it. We will get you a copy. We'll choose one winner. We'll get you a copy of the book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And hopefully we can get that autograph for you and get it back to you. Share this episode with people you know who will benefit from the stuff that we're talking about. This is how we grow this grassroots movement. This is how we help more people and get this information out there. And of course, go to iTunes, leave us a 5-star review. Let us know how much you like the show. If we read your review on the air, we will hook you up with a little care package. And that's it. Thank you guys for spending some time with us today. Dr. Seyfried, thank you for all you do. Thank you for your work, your contributions, and your time with us today.
Okay, thanks.